I'm going to go ahead, since we're a couple minutes after 12, and introduce Ashley. So just a little bit about her background. Ashley Brantley, just like me, she has a bachelor's and a master's of science degree from Auburn University, and with her emphasis being in fruit and vegetable production. Before she got started serving as a UGA extension agent, she did get some field experience working for the Alabama Cooperative Extension Service after she graduated with her master's degree. So she's worked in multiple extension systems and is a really good resource for folks who have questions regarding backyard production of pretty much anything. Ashley also has worked in greenhouse production with Auburn University, taking care of our satsumas and other types of citrus, and has participated in a myriad of different research projects fruit related with Auburn University. So we have a great resource here to help us today. Again, Ashley is currently the Muskogee County Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension Agent, but before she got started there, she actually has served some time in Southeast Georgia at Ware County as a 4-H agent. So she really is a well-rounded extension faculty member, and we're so happy to have her with us today. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ashley, and I hope you enjoy this presentation.
All right, well, thank you so much, Ashley, and welcome everyone. Let's go ahead and get started with today's topic, which is growing citrus for home production. Well, there we go. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started by taking a quick glimpse at kind of citrus's background before we really delve into some of the different varieties. Next, we'll move on to establishment and those requirements, protocols, and practices, and then really how to care for and maintain your citrus trees before lastly addressing harvest for these different varieties. All right, so as you might have already guessed, citrus is part of the citrus family, scientifically known as Rudiaceae. So in this family, there are a few herbaceous perennials, but mostly it's going to be woody shrubs and trees that have really fragrant flowers and variable fruit. Now, some of the fruit that we are most familiar with from this particular family are going to be your oranges, your grapefruits, your lemons, and your limes. Something to note that the fruit that we eat the most from this particular family is really pulpy flesh and has a leathery rind. Botanically, it is actually considered a berry. Now, you might have guessed, but this particular fruit crop, because it is subtropical, is not really native here in the U.S. It was actually introduced by Spanish explorers in the 16th century when they landed around the St. Augustine, Florida area. So citrus is actually fairly adaptable for home use. It can be grown in a backyard orchard as a specimen tree. It also does well in containers. And so with the right attention and care, it can really be grown successfully, especially in more of the southern and coastal areas of Georgia. If you notice over here on the right-hand side of the screen, there is a map of Georgia that's been broken up into 3 different zones. Again, that coastal and southern area of Georgia, or Zone A, is really going to be best suited for citrus production here in the state. As you move up a little bit, you'll notice Zone B. Now, citrus can be grown in Zone B, but it will definitely need cold protection. And then lastly, you have Zone C, and it can be grown here, but really you should use extreme caution, and it's going to need some management and cold protection for sure. So as you can see, when it comes to growing citrus in Georgia, freeze protection is really going to be the most limiting factor, and really having adequate cold protection when it comes to production. All right, so next we're going to delve into varieties and what can really be grown here. So when it comes to citrus varieties, they are typically organized by their traits and uses. And so it's broken up into your sweet citrus and your acid citrus. Now your sweet citrus are going to be the ones that are typically consumed on a daily basis in some form or fashion. So whether it's fresh or in juice or canned or in some other food commodity. And this is going to be your mandarins, your sweet oranges, and your grapefruit. Now, acid citrus, on the other hand, is more of an accent fruit, and you're going to see this more in drinks and desserts and as a decoration on a plate. And this will be your lemons, your limes, and your kumquats. Now, as with most other fruit crops, there are many types of citrus that can be grown. However, some varieties are really going to perform better than others. And so you really want to make sure that you carefully consider what can be grown if given a choice to grow your citrus outside. You want to make sure that you are choosing varieties that are ready for harvest early in the season, because often freezes can damage fruit. So again, the most limiting factor when it comes to citrus production, especially here in Georgia and in the southeast, is going to be, of course, freeze damage and having adequate cold production for this particular fruit crop. So let's go ahead and get started at looking at some of the different varieties. Let's start with sweet citrus, mainly mandarins. Now, mandarins are really known for having super flavorful fruits. They kind of have a luscious, deep orange colored flesh. They're known for loose skins. I'm sure most of you have heard the kid glove friendly, and they have relatively few seeds. Now, some of the fruits that are included in this particular class or variety, again, are going to be your mandarins, your satsumas, tangerines, and tangerine hybrids. Now, depending on where they are grown within the country, the term mandarin and tangerine can actually be used interchangeably. So just keep that in the back of your mind when talking about some of these different mandarins. And so you also need to note that cross-pollination is actually required for tangerines and tangerine hybrids, whereas the rest of the fruit within this particular class are considered self-fruitful, so they won't need a partner. All right, so the first one of the mandarins is going to be satsumas. Now, these are actually the most cold tolerant of sweet citrus, and they can actually be grown quite successfully here in Georgia and in the southeast. And so this particular sweet citrus, again, is self-fruitful and is known for producing consistent crops that are actually ready pretty early in the season, anywhere from September to November. And so something to note here with satsumas is oftentimes when they are ready for harvest, they can still be green on the outside, and that's okay. What you're going to want to do once you start seeing some color change with your fruit is really tasting it, and it's going to be based off of whether you feel like that fruit is at the quality that you want it to be at to start harvesting. And so you can start harvesting a few here and there. These actually store fairly well on the tree, and so harvesting a few over a timely period works out well for satsumas. Some of the most popular varieties out there are Owari, which is the most popular with commercial and homeowners when it comes to satsuma varieties. There's also Brown Select and Armstrong Early that do fairly well and could possibly be other options. Now, next is tangerines, and behind satsumas, tangerines are going to be the next choice when it really comes to cold hardiness and crop reliability. Two of the best varieties out there for tangerines are going to be Dancy and Pumpkin. Both of these are self-fruitful. Something you want to keep in mind with these two, however, which is a slight drawback, is that oftentimes the fruit may not develop fully before a freeze hits, usually around the mid-December time period. Also, you'll want to keep in mind that pumpkin is less cold resistant or tolerant than Dancy. And so if possible, if you could go with an earlier ripening variety for tangerines, such as with clementine, you'll be a little bit better off when it comes to growing tangerines. Something to note with clementine is it will need a partner. It requires cross-pollination. And so it will need another tangerine or tangerine hybrid. All right, so next is going to be the hybrids, which are also somewhat cold hardy. The best one for home use is going to be Orlando, which is a tangelo. It's a hybrid of a tangerine and a grapefruit. The fruit are going to be very similar to tangerines. There's some other varieties out there that will also do well. These listed, Lee, Robinson, Nova, and Page, are actually earlier season varieties that you could possibly use. Something to keep in mind with these also is that these selections will require cross-pollination, except for Lee. But another drawback for Lee is that it's not really as cold hardy as some of the other ones and might not do so well in our area. All right, so next we have sweet oranges, and these can actually be grown in the lower part of the state, but they will definitely require adequate cold protection. The best selection for home use will be Hamlin due to its cold hardiness. It is also self-fruitful and early ripening as well. Amber Sweet is a sweet orange hybrid, which is another possible option for homeowners. The only problem with Amber Sweet is it's hard to find, and so the availability may or may not be there for this particular one. All right, so another option for homeowners wanting fresh fruit is navel oranges. Navels, however, produce smaller crops than non-navels and are not quite as successful as other sweet oranges. One drawback is that the fruit can actually dry out before it is fully mature. So ones that will do well here are Washington and Caracara. Note that Dream and Summerfield might not do as well. They have issues that should be considered. All right, so the last one for our sweet citrus is going to be grapefruit. So notice that is not as cold hardy as the oranges. And so it can still be grown here, but it will be more restricted to the lower coastal areas for successful fruit production. Some of the varieties that will do well include Marsh, Red Blush, Ruby, and Ruby Star. Now, most of these are seedless, and note that they can be harvested in the typical citrus timeline of September, October timeline, but if you can keep it pushed back to about November or December, you'll have better quality fruit. All right, so now we're going to switch gears just a little bit and move on to acid citrus. We're going to be starting with kumquats because these are actually the most cold hardy of the acid fruits. And so it is actually a quite charming, attractive little tree, and the fruit are quite delicious. They can be eaten peel and all. These are used a lot in desserts, but also jellies and jams and candies. And so of the varieties available, you have Nagami. This one's known for having more of a pear-shaped fruit. There's also Marumi and Miwa. And Miwa is actually the most popular one with homeowners, and its fruit is rounder in shape and actually has a sweeter taste, even though it is an acid fruit or an acid citrus. All right, another really attractive tree for homeowners is calamondins. It also has a good cold hardiness factor to it. Its fruit looks very similar to tangerine. However, the pulp is a little more acid, and so it can actually be used as an alternative to lemon or lime. But it's something to note here is that it kind of takes a little while for the fruit to mature, and sometimes it can take up to a year. So a little bit of patience required for this one in regards to fruit production. All right, so next is lemons. And when it comes to lemons, we're really only going to be looking at one today, and that is the Meyer lemon. Now, Meyer lemon is actually not a true lemon. It is a cross between a lemon, or thought to be a cross between a lemon and a sweet orange. And the only reason this one is mentioned today because it is the most cold hardy of the lemons. And so it's really the only one that will do well here. It is known for having reliable crops, but it can take several months to mature and are usually ready for harvest around the fall winter time frame. All right, so our last variety that we're going to talk about today are going to be lime hybrids. And I saved them for the last because limes are actually the most cold sensitive of all the citrus that we can grow here. And so Eustace limequat is actually the most cold hardy of the bunch. Again, it's another really attractive tree. It does well as a container plant. The fruit are very similar to limes and can serve as an alternative. And so again, another cute, charming tree that produces really good fruit and will do well in a container. All right, so now we know a little bit more about what can be grown. Let's take a look at establishment and what will be needed to get these citrus trees growing. All right, so first, when it comes to establishment, you really want to look at your rootstocks. Citrus, along with most other tree fruits, really do not perform well on their own root systems and will need a rootstock. And so citrus is typically budded on rootstocks because they are better suited for our particular growing conditions, especially cold hardiness. And so just a quick reminder about rootstocks. Rootstocks are going to be those lower few inches of the trunk, and it's also going to include the root system. Now your cyan is going to be the rest of your trunk, your branches, your leaves, your flowers, and your fruit. Now when it comes to selecting citrus at the nursery, unfortunately, you are going to be at the mercy of what is available. And so I'm not really going to get too much into the different rootstocks that are used for citrus. Just know that trifoliate orange is an option. Under the trifoliate oranges, there is a dwarf selection called Flying Dragon. Also, sometimes sour orange as well. It is used as well. It's another common option. But just know, unfortunately, when it comes to selection, you might not have as much say as to which rootstock you're getting. But knowing that citrus is grafted is really important to know. All right, so after rootstock selection is tree selection. And when selecting a citrus or really any fruit, really, you want to make sure that you're growing something that you want to eat. And so other than looking at what rootstocks are available, there's really other factors that need to be included in your decision, such as your cold hardiness. Again, it's the most limiting factor when it comes to citrus production. Also, you want to look at pollination. Is it self-fruitful? Or is it going to need a partner, such as clementine and some of the other tangerine hybrids? And then, are there particular pest issues that you need to be mindful of when growing that particular variety? And so when purchasing trees from a nursery, most of the time they're going to be sold containerized or in a pot already. Oftentimes, it's balled or in burlapped, but that option is not as frequent as containerized. And just be mindful of those two different ways. It'll affect planting, which is next. So again, just know that those considerations should really be taken under advisement when selecting your tree. And so, as with most other fruit crops, citrus really need full sun and good drainage when it comes to production. So when you're selecting your site, you really want to look for those key needs. For proper fruit production, again, at least 6 to 8, with 8 being the best option when it comes to full sun. And so if you find that your site is on heavy soils and you're not getting that good drainage, there are other options. You can actually plant on mounds in a raised bed kind of setting that's about 8 to 12 inches high. That will kind of help combat and alleviate some of those drainage issues and compaction issues. And so make sure that your site is also away from septic tank and drainage fields. Know that tree roots can actually penetrate and clog those pipes, and also what's flowing through those pipes can cause toxicity issues for your fruit crop. All right, so if possible, if you can locate your tree near a shelter or on the south side of your home or another structure, that will actually help with freeze protection. And it will also offer protection from some of those northeasterly winds that come in down around the winter time. And so when selecting your site, you want to take into account your tree size. And so for standard trees like your satsumas and your tangerines, you want to keep your spacing about 15 to 20 feet apart if you're growing in more of a home orchard setting. But for your smaller trees, such as your lemons and your kumquats, and if you're using a dwarfing rootstock for your citrus, you can get away with some closer spacing, about 8 to 10 feet by 18 feet. And so once you have selected a site, the next step is going to be planting. And so for planting, I've kind of broken it up into in-ground and container, and we'll get to container here in just a second. So something to note, citrus can actually be planted any time of the year. However, with most fruit crops, again, the best time is going to be late winter, early spring. And so before planting, you really want to make sure that your site is cleared of grass and weeds. You want to make sure that you have about a 4 to 5 feet diameter of a weed-free zone, and then that area is spaded or broken up before planting. And so make sure that at planting, the hole is slightly larger than the container, so you can make sure that all of your root system is accommodated. Remove the tree from the container, and you want to make sure that you're inspecting your roots before planting, because if the plant is pot bound, you're going to want to cut vertical slits in the root ball for proper root growth and development for future years to come. All right, so next you're going to make sure that when you are placing your tree in the hole that the root ball is level with the soil surface. Bare root trees, as I mentioned earlier, that are balled, burlap, you're going to want to make sure that those roots are spread out, and if you can, remove some of that potting soil that is around the root system at planting. That way your roots have a better chance of establishing in the soil that you are planting them in. Make sure that when you are filling the hole back that you stop about halfway, add water, and lightly tamp the soil down. This is going to help settle the soil and eliminate any possible air pockets that might be in there. And so your roots have direct contact with that soil. And then you're going to, of course, finish filling the hole, water again before you're really making sure that that soil has good contact with the root system and with the trunk. You don't want to do it too harshly. You want to make sure that you're doing it lightly, but that you're eliminating those air pockets. So after planting, you will want to cut the branches back if this hasn't already been done at the nursery or before purchasing. And so you'll want to cut them back to about 6 to 12 inches. Again, this is if it has not been done before purchase. And other than that, there's really no other pruning needed throughout the growing season. You'll want to build the water basin around your tree. This is about 36 inches in diameter, and your walls will want to be about 4 inches high. This will actually degrade during the season, so you don't have to worry too much about water sitting in that area for too long. Speaking of watering, you're going to want to water at least twice weekly for the first 2 weeks after planting. Afterwards, you can scale back a little bit and only water about once weekly when needed. So as I mentioned, there's another option for growing citrus, and that is in a container. This method is actually the best way to protect your trees from cold damage, as they can be moved to a protective area whenever whenever inclement weather is on the horizon. And so smaller trees, of course, are naturally going to be better suited for this, such as your lemons and your kumquats and your calamondins. And so when growing in a container, you want to make sure that it is of the adequate size. You're going to want a container roughly about 20 gallons. The bigger, the better. And so your tree will eventually start to outgrow its container. Not immediately, but several years down the road, you'll start to notice a little bit of leaves dropping and things like that. So you might want to reevaluate your situation, maybe move it to a larger container, or some pruning might be needed. Some of the most common issues that homeowners run into when growing citrus in containers is overwatering and overfruiting. And so when it comes to watering your citrus when it's in a container, you want to keep a mindful check on it and keep a watch. Make sure that you're doing the hand soil test, sticking your finger in there, seeing if the soil is dry, at least within that top 1 inch before re-watering. Also, if your tree is overfruiting, you might want to consider doing some fruit thinning. So possible options for issues that might arise when growing citrus in a container. All right, so now that we know a little bit more about establishment and our trees are established in our site, let's move on to care and maintenance that will be needed throughout the growing season and for years beyond. All right, so the first thing we really want to look at is fertilization. Of course, annual fertilization is needed with most fruit crops for proper growth and fruit quality. And so newly planted trees, keep in mind, will not need fertilizer until that first real flush of growth starts, and that usually happens in spring. It can be roughly about 6 weeks after planting, depending on when you are planting. So roughly around March is when you want to consider maybe putting out that first real application of fertilizer. If possible, make sure that that application is of a complete fertilizer, such as a 888 or a 1010. You can even use a 1313. Make sure that it contains those secondary and micronutrients that citrus really needs. As you can see from the pictures on the right-hand side, there's many options out there that are formulated specifically for citrus that will actually offer up the nutrients that your plants need to make it through the growing season. So during the first year, you want to make sure that you're spreading your fertilizer in a circle around your tree, making sure that you're staying away from the trunk. Now, oftentimes homeowners forget that that fertilizer needs to be watered in so it can move through the soil profile and actually get to your roots where it can be taken up by the plant. A general rule of thumb when it comes to fertilizing is that your area that you're covering with your fertilizer really should be twice the diameter of your tree canopy. And so an easy way to actually accomplish this is to align your left shoulder with the outer branches of your tree and have your fertilizer in your right hand. And you'll walk around the tree spreading that fertilizer in roughly a 12 to 18 inch band around the tree. Again, another easy way to make sure that it is applied where it needs to go and so that the tree can take it up and use it to its benefit. So during the first 3 years, you really want to make sure that you're fertilizing in April, in June, and July. Make sure that you're refraining from applying fertilizer after July, though. This actually interferes with cold hardiness by promoting new growth with your citrus trees, and that's what you don't want. Unfortunately, it won't allow your tree to go into that dormant period that it needs to make it more cold tolerant. And so after the third year, you only want to make sure that you're applying fertilizer in March and again in either June or July. And so, as always, make sure that you read your fertilizer label and that you are following those instructions. You really want to make sure that you're paying attention to the rates that you are applying. Over fertilization, while it might seem like a good idea, can actually lead to a multitude of problems. And so make sure that you're putting out the right rate for your citrus trees. Okay, so an issue that new young trees often face, especially during production, is competition with weeds. And so you really want to make sure that you have some weed control practices in place for these new young trees. And oftentimes manual or mechanical means for weed control is the best practices for this. And this includes, unfortunately, hoeing and hand pulling and other means such as this. If at all possible, you want to try to refrain from using chemicals. You can possibly use mulches as well, but with mulches, you want to make sure that you are keeping those organic mulches at least 12 inches away from the tree. Again, this can lead to pest issues, especially foot rot, which we're going to talk a little bit about later on. And so something else to note is that having this weed-free zone under the drip line is recommended for mature trees, but it's not necessarily needed. However, it will aid in cold protection, and we'll address that more in just a minute. But typically, a weed-free area is still recommended for mature trees as well. So, as I was mentioning earlier, most of the time, the framework has already been established before most nursery-grown citrus trees are purchased and will not really need pruning for the rest of the season. And so what you are going to want to do is be mindful of suckers, and you're going to want to remove those during the growing season. Now, these typically occur, as you can see on the picture on the left, under the graft union, where you can see that differentiation between the trunk and the bottom 2 inches. And so those green sprouts coming up with the thorns, those are going to be your suckers, and oftentimes that is what they will look like. Now, these will affect the growth and development of your tree, and so you want to really make sure that you remove those. And if you remove them before they get too big, you can actually just go out there with your hand and snap them off. I was actually reading something about this earlier, that snapping them off actually has a chemical reaction with the plant instead of pruning them off, and they're less likely to come back. So side note to keep in mind there. All right, so as with most fruit crops, there is a training procedure that comes along with them, such as with prunus cultivars, your peaches, open center is really best for them. Apples have another training system that goes along with them. But with citrus, that's really not needed. The natural form actually works really well for production, and so they don't need to be what quote unquote trained as some other fruit crops need to be. However, you will still need to remove dead and crossing branches, water suckers also, and these are typically removed again during the dormant season, January and February. You want to make sure that when you're making these cuts, you're making them flush at the collar, and that you're not leaving any stubs out, which can lead to disease issues. And so oftentimes when growing citrus in backyard production, and they're grown in the ground, freeze damage can happen. But if it does happen, you want to make sure that you're not really pruning until about that second flush of growth, which happens around the July, August time frame. That way you have time to fully assess where the damage happened, and you can make sure that you're pruning that out. So just to talk a little bit about the flushes of growth with citrus, there's three main flushes during the growing season. The first happens in spring, roughly around March, again around the August time frame, and then the last one is in the fall around October. Just something to note. Okay, so we've kind of harped on this a little bit, but it's the most important concern for home growers, and that is cold protection. And that's really just for citrus production in general. Again, it is the most limiting factor when it comes to production. And so temperatures in that mid to high 20s can kill or damage trees. Temperatures within the 26 to 28 degree range can freeze fruit. And so you really want to make sure that you have a plan in place for this. Note that, of course, young, weak, and diseased trees are more susceptible to damage from freezes than mature, established trees. And so you really want to make sure that you're encouraging the trees going dormant or hardening off. And this includes that no late fertilization. As I mentioned earlier, no fertilization after July. You want to make sure that you're not really doing any late pruning as well, and that you're doing everything within your power to really help protect these trees from possible cold damage. So for young trees, actually the best protection is using a soil bank. And this is especially during the first 4 years of a tree's life. And so soil banks are actually mounds of clean soil that are piled up around the tree. As you can see in that bottom right-hand picture, it's piled up around the trunk, typically to the lowest branches. You want to make sure it's at least about 15 inches up. Something to note that with the soil banks, the only protection that the tree will receive are for those portions that are under the bank. Now, everything above the bank typically will regrow, but again, your tree will probably die back until that point. So to really be effective when using soil banks, you need to make sure that they are put up before the first freeze happens and then removed after the last freeze. You want to make sure that you're not leaving those soil banks up. Past that point, it can actually lead to pest and disease issues. So other options actually include trunk wraps. Something to know with trunk wraps is that oftentimes they only offer a few degrees of protection. Now there's options out there. You can use foam rubber, spun fiberglass. There are many ones that are also available for purchase. Keep in mind that these actually work best on young trees and not mature trees. Whatever material that you do decide to use though, make sure, that it's at least 6 inches thick and that it has contact with the soil. And so any gaps in between that trunk wrap and the soil can lead to issues. And so as with the soil banks, you want to make sure that they are put out before that first freeze and then removed after the last freeze. So I know we talked about more so the trunk portion of the tree, and while this is essential, you also need to keep in mind that your leaves on your citrus trees also should be shielded from cold damage. And so if you only have a few trees, really covers work well here, using blankets or quilts and then applying a plastic layer over that can really help protect the canopy. Know that if any leaves actually come in contact with the plastic, it can kill them. So a 2-layer system works best here, where you apply the blanket or the quilt first and then the plastic over top. And so again, that works fairly well with the 2-layer system. So make sure that the covers are being put on again before the freeze and that you're anchoring them in place. So if there is any wind, it's not getting blown off. If you're using plastic covers, please make sure that you're removing them the next day. You want to make sure that you're waiting until air temperatures are above freezing for at least 3 hours before you're removing these layers. And so oftentimes you can use heat with these covers, like stringing Christmas lights in the trees using incandescent lights. You can possibly use heaters under the trees as well. Just make sure that if you are using some source of electricity, that you're being extremely careful there. And so, as I was mentioning earlier with the bare ground under the tree, having that weed-free area, that weed-free area can actually be watered before freeze, and the soil, as it's watered, actually absorbs, stores, and conducts that heat back up to the tree during freezes. And so it's actually beneficial to really have that weed-free area under the tree. And again, this is another option. All right, so besides needing cold protection, citrus unfortunately has some cultural issues that need to be considered during production and when growing citrus trees at the home. And so the first real one is flower or fruit drop. Now, this is a natural occurrence and it typically happens in spring, and this helps the tree deal with overproduction. And so another time that this can happen is around the May or June area when fruit is about marble size. The fruit will drop from the tree, and that's okay. Again, it's a natural occurrence and it helps with overproduction. Really, you only need about 1 to 2% of the flowers to have an adequate quality fruit crop. So in the grand scheme of things, 1 to 2% of flowers, that's not a lot of flowers that are needed. But again, you want to be mindful if something else is going on. Inspect your trees, but just know that this is a natural occurrence. Another natural occurrence is leaf drop. So healthy trees will actually lose a large amount of leaves. Again, this typically happens in the early spring time of the year. And so the reason this happens is because typical citrus leaves live about 18 to 24 months. And so what it's doing when it's dropping those leaves is kind of removing those older leaves that are no longer productive, no longer assisting the tree with growth and development. And so it will shed them and actually replace them with new leaves. Now, oftentimes, this is a natural occurrence, but again, you want to be attentive and check out your tree for any other possible issues that could occur, such as with insects or damage or something like that. But be mindful that, again, oftentimes this is a natural occurrence. Now, the last cultural issue we really need to address is fruit splitting, and this can actually happen with other fruit crops as well. This is primarily a problem with oranges and tangerines that happens in late summer. And what typically happens is we're going through a drought period, and so all of a sudden fruit growth stops, but then we're hit with a rain period where the tree is taking up all of that water and sending it off to the fruit, and all that rapid growth from that rain actually causes the fruit to split because it can't handle all that extra moisture. And so really the best way to help alleviate this, and this is with other fruit crops as well, is just make sure that you're keeping an eye and controlling the moisture levels for your fruit crops, and especially during the growing season. All right, so a key note here is that Oftentimes, citrus can be grown successfully without excessive care or difficulty or concern. For the homeowner, there's actually not a lot of pest and disease issues that come up. Now, that's not to say that they won't happen during the growing season, but oftentimes it's not serious and can typically be corrected through changing management practices. And so most of the time, pesticides will not be needed when it comes to citrus home production. And that's if you can deal with a little bit of unsightly tree and fruit appearance. And while it might seem like your tree has taken a downturn, it will not affect fruit quality. It just might not be as pretty as it could be otherwise. And so again, most of the time citrus can be grown successfully without a lot of other control measures needed. But for the times that you do need control measures, there are a few that you really should be mindful of, and some common ones are really addressed here. I try to include some pictures of what some of the common ones look like as well. And so some of the main ones include greasy spot, melanose, scab, and foot rot. And foot rot was the one I mentioned earlier that you really want to be mindful of when using mulches. And so this typically happens or occurs around where the bud union or the graft union is on your tree. Can lead to a water-soaked lesions that dry and crack and just overall diminishing your tree. And some of the other ones, such as greasy spot, melanose, and scab, again, be mindful of those. Those are common diseases that do happen. And so one of the diseases that is actually the most destructive right now for citrus production is citrus greening. Now, we won't go in great depths with this one, but I do want you to be mindful of it. And so citrus greening actually goes by another name, which is Huang Long Bing, and it stands for yellow shoot disease. Now, this disease is worldwide, but it is also prevalent here in the Southeast in Georgia. And so you need to be mindful of it. It's actually a bacterial disease that resides in the phloem of the tree, which is the food conducting tissue that circulates throughout the tree. And so please note that all citrus varieties can be affected by this particular disease, but sweet oranges and mandarins are actually highly susceptible. And so, again, it can affect all citrus varieties, but certain ones more so than others. So this disease is actually transmitted by the Asian citrus psyllid. And so that's not the only way it can be transmitted, but that is one of the key specimens here. Also using diseased budwood or diseased plant stock can transmit the disease. And so affected trees can actually hold off from showing symptoms for the first couple of years. And so when it does hit, you will know symptoms include some of these that you can see the mottling of the leaves. Please note in the bottom right-hand corner, the picture with the red ovals in the line, it will not happen symmetrically. Also, there's vein thickening, yellowing of shoots, twig dieback, and stunted growth. And so if you notice any of those symptoms, you really want to make sure that you contact your local extension agent so they can come out and check your tree. Also note that fruit set is relatively poor for infected trees and that they do not ripen evenly. And so you won't have that typical fruit shape. It will actually look lopsided. And also that it alters the taste of your fruit and it has more of a bitter medicinal sour taste to it. Unfortunately, at this time, there is no control available for this particular disease and no cure. And so one way that you can actually offset this is making sure that when you do purchase trees, that you're purchasing them from a certified nursery. That is really important as far as reducing the spread of this disease. Now, a little bit about the Asian citrus psyllid. Again, it is the vector for citrus greening, or Huang Long Bing, HLB. The adults and the immatures actually feed on the citrus leaves. And so with the Asian citrus psyllid, they have a piercing, sucking mouth part, which is something to note. And adults are actually relatively small, 3 to 4 millimeters in length. And as you can see on the bottom picture, they lay orange eggs in the new growth. And so also, the immatures, as they're developing, will emit the white wax, which you can see in that top right-hand picture, from their backsides. All right, so moving on from citrus screening, there are a few insects that are common on citrus trees as well. You might see some mites, can be rust mites, which are seen a lot on the fruit, red and two-spotted spider mites that feed on the leaves and the fruit. You can have scale, whether it be armored or soft. You can have aphids and white flies that actually feed on the leaves and shoots. And leaf miners is actually quite a common one as well. They dig tunnels through the citrus leaves. And so again, those are some of the most common ones that you will see. There are plenty more, of course, but again, these are the most common ones. All right, so we are coming to the end and about time to start wrapping up. But before we are done, let's briefly talk about harvest. And so harvest, of course, is going to differ depending on what variety you are growing and also where you are growing it. And so citrus, something to keep in mind, does not ripen after it is picked, like a lot of the other fruit crops that are out there. And so again, that's where that taste test really comes in handy, tasting your fruit before you harvesting it and making sure that it is at a level that you like. Again, most citrus will change colors from green to yellow or orange. However, satsumas, like I was mentioning earlier, can still have green on the rind and be ready for harvest. And so another thing to note with satsumas is they do not release cleanly from the stem. And so these will need to be clipped or otherwise you incur fruit damage. And so, again, the best way to really know if your fruit is ready, no matter which variety you are growing, is to pick a few and just taste them. And if you like the taste, go ahead and start harvesting. And so, something else to note, oftentimes the longer the fruit is allowed to stay on the tree, the sweeter it will be, because again, after it's harvested, it will not continue to ripen. So you really want to make sure those sugar levels are there before you harvest. And again, citrus can be stored on the tree for a short period of time, but you really want to make sure that most, if not all, is removed by about January, so you can make sure that your tree has enough reserves for fruit crop for the next growing season. All right, that is all I have for today, but I will be glad to stick around and answer any questions you might have.
That was great. Ashley, thank you so much.
Thank you.
A challenging topic with a lot of different types of citrus out there. So thank you for taking a good stab at it and letting us know what's possible in Georgia.
Yeah, no problem.
So we had quite a few questions. I tried to keep up with them the best I could. One of the questions that came up frequently was, what about fertility management for container grown citrus? Any best management practices for how to apply that effectively, and what do I use? Any tips there?
Okay, no, that is actually a really great question. And so when you are planting your citrus tree in your container, then would be a good time to really put out a slow release fertilizer. And slow release fertilizers are going to be more pelletized. And so you'll incorporate that with your potting mix at the time of planting. And so most of the time, those will last anywhere from 2 to 3 to 4 months. You really want to make sure that you're reading your label. And so that'll keep you covered for the first couple of months. But throughout the growing season, you can actually use a water-soluble fertilizer, and just, maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks, hit it with that the water-soluble fertilizer throughout the growing season, and that'll add some nutrients back to your container. Container-grown citrus can actually leach fertilizer because you're growing it in a more confined area, and so adding that water-soluble fertilizer throughout the growing season will make sure that it has the nutrients it needs. And then come back about spring again, when that new flush of growth is hitting, you can put out some more slow release fertilizer and kind of continue on with those practices throughout the growing season. And that should offer enough fertilizer for your citrus.
So, and fertility can be confusing, especially for
Right.
first-time gardeners or novice gardeners or even experienced gardeners. Nutrient deficiencies and even toxicities can be pretty confusing. Tell me, just what are some indicators that I need to maybe apply fertilizer, and maybe just give us an idea of, I suppose, what to look for as a sign of trouble, like a nitrogen deficiency, for example. What would my plant look like if it needed some nitrogen?
So most times when your plants need nitrogen, they're going to turn more of a yellow color. And so that will be consistent over your leaf. And most of the time it's going to hit that older growth first. And so look to your older leaves. If they're turning yellow, they might be showing signs of needing some help, needing some love, especially if you're growing container grown citrus. You can also always hit them with a water soluble fertilizer and see if they perk up any. Also, if you're ever in doubt of what is going on as far as fertilizer goes, always consult with your extension agent and they can help you with that. But if you are pretty certain that that's what's going on, it is a nutrient deficiency, as long as it's within the adequate time frame, you can always throw a little bit of fertilizer out there and just see if it does remedy the situation. And again, if it doesn't, make sure that you're consulting with your local extension agent, because it might be another issue at hand. But again, make sure that you're sticking within that time frame and you're not applying that fertilizer too late, or it'll affect your tree's ability to go dormant for winter damage and cold protection.
Another common question was, how do I know how much is enough or not enough when it comes to watering container citrus?
So my general rule of thumb when it comes to just containers in general is I use the finger test, and I insert my finger into that potting mix, and at least 1 inch down, if at the tip of your finger, if it feels dry and it does not feel moist at all, you want to make sure that you water, and you water thoroughly to where the water is coming out the bottom of your container. So you can make sure that all of the potting mix within that structure is completely moist.
Thank you. Another individual was curious if the establishment and care guidelines that you mentioned for getting a young planting started, is this similar for stone fruit and berries?
So stone fruit and berries are going to have their own requirements. And so you want to make sure that you are following the requirements for those particular crops. And the Extension Service and your local agent will actually have the information out there available for you. All you have to do is reach out to them and to get those establishment and those guidelines, care and maintenance, from them, and you will be successful. So just make sure that you're not following the same ones for each crop, because each crop has its own requirements.
Thank you. Someone else had asked, if you have a citrus that needs cross-pollination, does it need to be the same style, or can you have a lime or a lemon and they take care of cross-pollinating each other?
So that is actually a really good question. The ones that are going to need cross-pollination are going to be your tangerines and your tangerine hybrids. And so you'll want to stick with another selection that is also a tangerine and tangerine hybrid.
Thank you. Regarding cold protection, can soil banking and trunk wrapping be used together?
I would not use them together. I would use one or the other and make sure that your leaves are covered as well. Unfortunately, doing them together is not going to offer up better or more cold protection than using one or the other. And so really when it comes to young citrus, the soil bank is the one that's recommended and offers the best protection.
Thank you. Another question that came up a good bit is, what is going on? Why won't my plant flower? This one individual mentioned they have a key lime and a Meyer lemon grafted on dwarfing stock, container grown. They haven't flowered in several years. What could be going on?
That is actually a really good question. They have a Meyer lemon, and what was the other one? I'm sorry.
A key lime.
And they have a key lime. How are they grown?
They're on dwarfing stock in containers.
Dwarfing stock in containers. How old are the plants?
I do not know. I mean, they said they haven't flowered in several years, so I would imagine they're, on the older end, but maybe just speak to why you might not be getting flowering in general.
So, that's kind of a loaded question. And so really I would need to know what their management practices are for those particular trees. And they could probably narrow it down from there, but not knowing their growing situation, it's really hard to say. Do you have any words of wisdom on this one as well?
I mean, not really. It can be challenging growing citrus, and they do tend to, and I think a lot of it also depends on your location. Like, I always try to caution anyone against growing key lime in Georgia, just because we really aren't a hot enough climate for that to truly thrive. Some people do have a level of success, and that's wonderful. But it can be a challenge, especially the further north you go, the harder it is to keep a citrus plant happy. So I think I would call my county agent to come out and take a look if I was that individual.
For sure. Yeah. On that one, I think they would need to know more about the situation to say.
So let's see. Lots of container questions. Another individual asked, about storing container plants over the winter. So several folks are growing limes and lemons, and they want to know, what do I do with them in the wintertime to save them from the cold months? Can I just stick them in my garage? What do you recommend there?
Well, it will depend on their situation. So one of the great things about growing in containers is that they can be moved. Like I was mentioning earlier, it's actually one of the best ways to protect them from cold damage. And depending on your situation and what you have available, it is possible to stick them in their garage. I have known homeowners that do that, and they do just fine. And then they bring them out when the weather is appropriate, and they do just fine during the growing season. And so they just stick to that plan during the year, and again, they have fruit year after year. So assess your situation and see what will work best for you. But yes, they should do okay in that situation.
Thank you. And we do seem to be still on the container grown topic. That's where most of the questions were. Any specific varieties that you think are more successful container grown than others?
Well, as I was mentioning earlier, the smaller trees, especially the ones that are on dwarfing rootstocks, tend to do better in the container culture just because they are more restricted on the area that they are able to grow in. And so you really want to make sure that you have that balance between top growth and root growth. And so the smaller trees, which are going to be your lemons, your kumquats, your calamondins, they do better in citrus, in containers, just because they are a smaller stature. And so they have better balance when grown in containers. So if you can stick to those smaller ones or the ones on the dwarfing rootstock, they tend to do better in container culture.
Agreed. Here's a great question. Do Meyer lemons typically bloom multiple times?
So yes, actually they do. They will bloom throughout the year. Now you will actually get the better quality fruit from the ones that happen in the spring. So please note that. But yes, they actually do. And so one of my favorite things about citrus is smelling Meyer lemon blooms. They're heavenly. So
I agree. And something that can be very stressful, and I know you talked about it in your presentation, is just that fruit and flower drop that just normally happens in pretty much all citrus. You'll have this overabundance of blooms and you think, man, I'm in high cotton. And then they all drop off and it's just very upsetting, but you really only need, 1 or 2% of those,
right.
of the actual fruit crop to set for you to have more than enough. One person did ask though, and I think this is a good question. So you have your fruit crop set on, say, a container citrus. Any tips for thinning? How do I know what's too much on my plants?
That is a good question. And so generally when it comes for fruit production, and it will depend on the size of your fruit and what your particular tree can handle, and at what stage it's in as well. More mature trees, can handle larger crop loads than younger trees can. And so generally, if you can have a fruit that's one fruit, sorry, I'm trying to work this out in my head. From what the literature I've read says, if you can have one fruit for every 42 leaves, roughly, that should be enough reserve to have a quality crop. And so that's kind of hard to go out there and count all those leaves. So typically I say if you can have a fruit every 6 to 8 inches, that should be enough to get you through the season. But again, that's going to really go back to how old is your tree and at what stage is it in.
And I think that if you wouldn't mind elaborating on that a little bit right there, we get excited when we see that fruit and we really don't want to cut it off. How long do we need to wait to allow that citrus to have a crop so we can get a good tree structure and scaffolding developed so we don't get limb breakage in a weak tree? When can I let my plant have a crop?
Yeah, when can you let it have a crop? So generally the first few years of development should go towards establishment. And so if you can hold off on having a fruit crop those first couple of years, at least 2 to 3, if you can wait till the 3rd year, that will give your tree enough time to get established, get a good framework going, to build up its limbs so it's able to support that heavy crop load. That would be ideal. And so I know it's a really hard thing to want to do, to remove that potential crop that you might have, but if you can wait those several years, it will do your tree a world of good, and it will actually stress your tree out less if you can reduce that crop load.
I agree. It takes a tremendous amount of energy to create fruit. And when you have a very, very small plant, you have to make that choice. Like, do I want this tree to size up in these first 3 years to where I can have a decent crop later? Or do I want to kind of drag things out and slow this plant down? So cut the fruit off. I recommend having your first decent crop on year 4, but you might have a little bit on the tree in year 3.
That is true.
So we're down here in zone 8B. Can you plant a satsuma now, or would it be better to wait until fall?
So as I was saying earlier, it can be planted any time of the year. Ideally, it's best if you can wait till spring. And so if you already have your tree now, you can go ahead and plant it, but know that you will have to keep a very watchful eye on it to make sure that it is getting the water and the love that it needs to establish. If you can hold off and plant in fall, that would be better. Again, ideal time is early spring, but you can plant anytime. It will just need that extra love and attention to make it through the season.
I agree. So we had several folks inquire on where to get some information on a spray program and scouting for diseases and insects. You know, we don't have a very large commercial citrus industry in the state of Georgia. I would argue that Clemson and University of Florida probably have some homeowner resources. Any suggestions on where to point those who would like more information on pest and disease management and where they can find that information?
So you are right. They do have some great resources, so you can check with them. Also, your local extension agent can point you in the right direction as well. LSU actually has a really good homeowner guide for growing citrus as well. So knowing that citrus, is a highly big commodity down in Florida. Of course, they have extensive resources down there when it comes to growing citrus. But again, check with your local extension agent if you're not sure. Check with the University of Florida, Louisiana as well. But I will have to say, checking with your extension agent first, they can point you in the right direction if you're unsure about those items or resources.
So another question that came up in several different ways was winter care for a container citrus. What do I do once I have it inside? Do I need to bring in supplemental lighting? How often do I need to water? Any more comments just on winter care when you bring a container plant indoors?
So whether it's indoors or whether you're keeping it in the garage, you want to make sure that you are keeping an eye on it. If at all possible, if you can put it in a sunny location, that would be best. But obviously you want to make sure that it's still getting the resources that it's needing, even though it is during the dormant season. So you want to check it regularly for water. You want to make sure that you're not overwatering. Again, sticking it in a sunny location. It will not need fertilizer during this period, so you don't have to worry about that. But just make sure that you're keeping a watchful eye on it. If anything changes, of course, make sure that you're checking with your local extension agent and see if they can help you with that. But really at this point, your tree is in a dormant state, and so it's not going to need as many resources as it would during the growing season.
Thank you.
But again, still keep an eye on it.
Okay, and we are getting close to 1:15, so I won't hold you all hostage for much longer, but I do have a couple more questions. So one being, sometimes an individual will have a really great year and have a ton of fruit, and then the next year there's just not much of anything. Can you discuss alternate bearing in citrus, particularly satsumas, and how to break out of that cycle?
Right. Okay. So alternate bearing or biennial bearing, it goes by a couple of different terms actually. And so what that is one season you will have what we like to call a bumper crop. And so you'll just have a really good crop one season. And so what happens is your trees will put in most, if not all, of their resources into those particular fruits for that growing season. And so what happens is you have your large croplet, it's harvested, you're doing great. Come the next season, so much energy was expended in that larger crop the season before that it just doesn't have the reserves or the momentum to do the same that next following year. And so if you've noticed that you've got a bumper crop one season, you can help alleviate some of that stress and struggle for your tree by removing some of those fruits from that season, and it'll actually give your tree a bit of a break. And so when you come into that next growing season, your tree is not stressed from that previous crop that it just developed and produced. And so that will help alleviate some of that so that you have more of a reliable, consistent crop from year to year. And so, as I was mentioning earlier too, you can store citrus on your tree for a period of time, but you want to make sure that it is removed in a timely manner to make sure that you are not having that issue of alternate or biennial bearing that next growing season.
That was great. And so when you mean remove fruit in a timely manner, that doesn't mean once it's the size of my fist, now it's the time to remove it, right?
Right, right. And so, knowing that most citrus is ready about the fall winter time frame, you want to make sure that you are removing that fruit no later than roughly about January. So the tree has a time period there where it can recover, build up its reserves again for that next season.
Thank you. Okay, last tough question for you.
Okay.
A lot of individuals are interested in trying to grow citrus from seed. Can you explain why growing citrus from seed might not work out that well?
Okay, great. And so, yeah, as you mentioned, growing citrus from seed does not work out well. And as I was talking about earlier, citrus is normally budded or grafted onto a rootstock. And that is because those rootstocks have certain characteristics that really benefit citrus as far as for growing and development and production. And so growing citrus from seeds, sometimes the seeds aren't viable, and so you're not going to get a good turnaround trying to grow them from seed. And so again, budding is the typical practice for citrus production, and that's for a reason. And that's just to make sure that your citrus has the proper foundation needed for growth and development and for production. And growing from seed is just highly variable, and there's no way to guarantee success with that.
Thank you. Last question for you, and I will end the webinar. One individual asked, and I really love this question because I think that it speaks to the mission of what this program has been. How do I get in touch with my county agent, and what is their role?
So your role, depending on where you are, each system has a different format, and so really each county has an office. And so if you're unsure of where your office is, typically it's in your county seat. And so if you can figure out where your county seat, it is usually a part of the county government too. And so if you can get to their directory, oftentimes it is listed there. If you're ever in question, you can always Google as well. And so all extension services have a directory too, and so it can point you in the direction for your local agent. As mine and Ashley's roles, we are the agriculture and natural resources agent, and so anything agriculture or natural resources related, we are here to help with that, whether it be commercial or homeowner. And so you really want to make sure that you're reaching out to that individual within your county. And if you're unsure of who that is, your office can always point you in the direction of who would be best suited to answer your question.
Absolutely. And for those of you who may be tuning in from out of state, Ashley hit the nail on the head. Each state's extension service looks a little bit different. Your county agent might have multiple territories. They might have a single county, but either way, we're here to help you. I hope you have found this series helpful. I'm almost sad to see it go. We've covered so much ground over this past month. We've had wonderful attendance. Thank you so much for participating. I want to encourage everyone to please fill out that survey so we know if the presentation was helpful to you. Thank you so much for attending. We hope you enjoyed it, and be on the lookout for more future programming from UGA Extension. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you.